Good day. Over the next few days, we are going to see major NATO exercises, European Defender 2021, take place principally in Southeast Europe, with the focus being on the Balkans. Around 28,000 troops from six NATO states are going to participate in these exercises. Obviously, the key partner will be the United States, but interestingly, there will be contingents from Ukraine and Georgia involved as well. Now, this exercise is apparently a reheated version of an exercise, European Defender 2020, which was originally slated to take place in December 2020. It had to be cancelled because of the pandemic crisis, and we have now seen this exercise now start in May. Now, I find that an interesting conjunction of dates, because if one thinks carefully to a number of events which were supposed to happen in May, the coincidence of them, had they all happened in the way initially planned, would have been striking. First of all, there was that major deployment of Ukrainian troops to eastern Ukraine, which began in March of this year, and which many anticipated would lead to a Ukrainian offensive in the first week of May. The second event, obviously, was the US deployment of two powerful US warships, two Arleigh Burke destroyers, to the Black Sea. Then there was the unrolling of the sanctions, which took place a few weeks ago. And of course, there were also the meetings between people like President Zelensky of Ukraine and Turkish President Erdogan, in which Erdogan announced his support for Ukraine's membership of NATO and his determination to provide Ukraine with weapons, including drones, the sort of Turkish drones which were used so effectively in the fighting in the Caucasus a few weeks ago. Now, it's quite possible, and many will say, that all these movements and actions were intended to be coincidental. I do wonder. It does seem to me, and I've discussed this already, that all of these moves of troops and forces seem to have some elements of coordination between them. Bear in mind, it was not just US warships that were moving into the Black Sea, but British warships also, and indeed they have done. The British are still sending their warships into the Black Sea, and there's two carrier groups, one American, one British, apparently are present, steaming around the eastern Mediterranean. And they were also apparently intended to be coups in Belarus at around this time. And of course, there was expectations or hopes that the Navalny affair would result in massive protests in Russia as well. There was even some wild talk in parts of the Western media that these protests would be the biggest protests in Russian history since the fall of the Soviet Union. Well, as I said, it may be that all of these events are disconnected. It may be that we're just looking at a coincidence, that these are random events which weren't intended all to be linked up together, that they're not part of any great plan. But as I said, I do wonder. I am sure that the Russians wonder also. I am quite certain that there are people in Moscow who are saying to each other, and who indeed have been saying to each other for some time, that all of these moves were clearly coordinated and that Russia had to face a concerted push over the last few weeks, probably hatched around the time that the current administration either came into office or was confirmed that it would come into office as a result of the November 2020 presidential election, and that Russia obviously had to take steps to preempt these moves as they happened. And if that is correct, then the Russian moves were, frankly, devastating. Firstly, the Russians deployed, as we know, 100,000 troops, some people say 200,000 troops, along the Ukrainian border, and gave all kinds of very strong warnings that if Ukraine did attack the two breakaway republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, Russia would intervene militarily to prevent those two republics being overrun, and that such a war would lead to Ukraine's destruction. We also saw the Russians move decisively against Navalny, who was packed off to prison, where he still is, and the protests, which were widely expected, fizzled out, and turned out to be very small. The Russians have since acted to close down Navalny's organization, and I understand that they're preparing to move against various other Western-backed NGOs and agencies which operate on Russian territory and which receive Western support and Western funding. The Russians also acted very, very toughly to crush or stamp out the supposed alleged coup, which supposedly was due to take place in Belarus, which was due to start supposedly on Sunday of this week. So, if there was a plan to use all these concerted maneuvers to put pressure on Russia, or perhaps even to sustain a military offensive by Ukraine in eastern Ukraine, well, all these moves failed catastrophically. The Russian preemptive steps took the West apparently by surprise. They caused enormous dismay, and they caused the entire operation, if it was an operation, to run completely awry. The Ukrainian offensive, if such was ever planned, has now been conclusively called off. The Ukrainians talk about a ceasefire on the conflict line, even though they're dragging their heels about agreeing to its exact terms. The US warships are not going to the Black Sea, even if the British warships are, and Belarus has survived the coup attempt, and many of the ringleaders of the coup have been arrested. The latest information there, by the way, is that Lukashenko has now sacked a large number of security officials who perhaps were seen as being involved in the coup in some way. So Russia's grip, or rather Lukashenko's grip on Belarus, has tightened, and Lukashenko seems now to be forging forward with integration processes with Russia, which he had previously resisted. There's been a summit meeting between himself and Putin, and we learned that all sorts of integration plans and agreements, basically to integrate Belarus industries with Russian industries, have now been agreed, and that they're due to come into operation in October. So all of these Russian counter-moves appear to have been very effective. I would add that there is one other Russian counter-move which does not appear to have attracted as much attention as perhaps it should, which is that the Russians, very angry and annoyed by Erdogan's outspoken support for Ukraine, started to place restrictions on the travel of Russian tourists to Turkey. In fact, flights from Russia to Turkey were cancelled, causing the Turks to fear loss of hard currency earnings from Russians traveling to Turkey and spending money there. Now, this would be a very severe blow for a Turkish economy which is already in deep trouble, and it has led to a call from Erdogan to Putin and an attempt apparently by Erdogan to patch things up with Putin. The latest word is that the Turks are now busy buying the various Russian medications to deal with the pandemic. I should add that the Russian excuse for imposing those travel restrictions was the fact that the pandemic in Turkey was allegedly running out of control. So Erdogan has done that, and it seems that he seems to be trying to mend his fences with Moscow and to perhaps in some way dial back some of that support for Ukraine that he was giving. So the Russian countermoves have been successful, and the major change in the political geography of Eastern Europe, which some people expected and which might have perhaps led to a crisis in Russia itself, and which the Russians perhaps felt was orchestrated, well, that has failed to happen. Instead, as we all know, the United States is now busy trying to organize a meeting with Putin in which Putin has made clear that he's going to lay out and insist upon observance and adherence of what he calls Russia's red lines. Now, all of that is an important summary, but it is, in fact, European Defender 2021 that I want to just focus briefly upon. Now, there's been a very interesting discussion about European Defender 2021 by the indispensable Scott Ritter, who is a former US Marine Corps intelligence officer and someone who is far more knowledgeable about all of this, all of these military affairs, than I am. And Scott Ritter has made the point that, in fact, what European Defender 2021 shows is not how strong NATO is militarily, but on the contrary, how weak it is. He points out that many of the logistical links in the Balkans are extremely weak, that the various forces that are being deployed are hardly integrated to any great extent with each other or with the forces of the United States, and that in fact what European Defender 2021 shows is that the West simply cannot withstand Russia militarily. This is his final paragraph. The fact that the emphasis on European Defender 2021 is the Western Balkans of NATO, the clear intention of NATO in conducting these exercises was to flex its muscles in the face of Russia's ongoing military deployments opposite its border with Ukraine. So he's a former intelligence officer, and he says that these deployments were connected with the Ukraine situation, exactly as I said. Russia was able to mobilize more than 100,000 combat-ready troops from 2 field armies in a matter of days. NATO simply does not have a viable response to such a capability. Exercises such as European Defender 2021, far from providing a statement of deterrence designed to intimidate Russia, are but a reminder of NATO's impotence in the face of Russia's own impressive military capability. The bottom line is, if push came to shove, NATO is incapable of defending NATO. Now, those words are said not by a Russian intelligence official, but by Scott Ritter, a former US Marine intelligence officer. And I would add that they correspond with my own impression. It's always seemed to me as if the US and its NATO allies have never succeeded in replicating the extraordinary Russian ability to mobilize large groups of forces at extraordinary speed and to launch them into battle from practically a standing start. On the contrary, Western military deployments tend to be extremely slow and painstaking and very incremental, giving ample notice to a potential adversary of what they're about. And on top of that, and beyond that, they also bring together a strange blend of troops, many of whom are not especially well integrated with each other. Some of the troops within these NATO forces are well trained and well motivated. The American troops, for one, the British and the French troops, possibly. Of others, one simply cannot say that at all. Many of the European NATO states apparently do not have viable armies. I have some information about this from from sources, from sources in Poland, and I understand that the Polish army, once one of the strongest in Europe, and one of the most powerful armies in the former Warsaw Pact, has now been extraordinarily run down and is now a shadow of the force it once was. Given that that is so, faced with an army like the Russian, able to mobilize large numbers of well-trained and well-equipped troops rapidly, and to send them into action with the minimum of notice, it's very, very difficult to see how NATO could succeed. I would point out that in the South Ossetia War, in the war in the Caucasus in 2008, the Russians were able to deploy 10,000 troops to the Caucasus and carry out at whirlwind speed an extraordinarily complex military operation against Georgia, which ended in Georgia's comprehensive defeat within just 5 days. Now, that was at a time when the Russian military was still very much in recovery mode after the crisis of the 1990s. Much of its equipment was old. Its communications equipment apparently didn't work particularly well in the mountains. And yet, notwithstanding that, the Russians were able to carry out that operation at extraordinary speed and with extraordinary decisive results, winning a war against an opponent, Georgia, which on the ground actually outnumbered the forces which Russia deployed, and doing so in just 5 days. And then, of course, that was in 2008, but then, of course, in 2015, the Russians were also able to deploy, again at lightning speed, a large number of air assets to Syria, turning the tide of the war there, and in fact bringing the Syrian army close to victory, or at least within sight of victory, within a year, with the victory that was achieved in Aleppo at the end of 2016. So we see how fast the Russians can move and how effective the Russians are when they do move. And I'm going to add something else. In my opinion, the balance of military power is going to continue to shift even further over the next couple of years in Europe in Russia's favor. Most of the heavy equipment the Russian army military still uses is modernized versions of equipment left over from the period of the Soviet Union. It should be said that these tanks and armored vehicles and artillery pieces and all the rest are apparently, in most cases, extensively modernized from what had been the case during the Soviet times, and that most of the Russian combat troops, those in the combat units, are now volunteers instead of conscripts, as they also were in Soviet times. But nonetheless, it remains the case that the Russians, if they were to fight a war today, would be doing so principally with legacy weapons. There are some changes. The Russian Air Force has been thoroughly modernized with much more effective and advanced military fighter jets like the Su-35 and the Su-34 fighter bomber. Also, the Russians have increasingly deployed a powerful array of ballistic missiles, of which the most important is the Iskander missile, which can be used apparently with great accuracy to attack base areas in NATO's rear. But as I said, most of the equipment, though refitted and in many cases modernized, is still Soviet-era legacy equipment left over from the time of the Soviet Union. However, over the next few years, that is likely to change. The Russians, since the mid-2010s, have been working on a new series of armoured vehicles and artillery pieces, like the Armata tank, the T-90 tank, the Boomerang wheeled vehicle, the Kurganets tracked vehicle, you name them. And they're also busy developing a new array of drone weapons, like the Orion and the Altius, which are apparently shortly due to enter service after a protracted period of development. So, and in addition and beyond that, there are rumors, which of course one can't really confirm, that the Russians are also forging ahead even further with developing their enormously powerful and very advanced electronic warfare capabilities. Lastly, the Russians have completely modernized their radar systems and their communication systems, which completely broke down at the time of the South Ossetia War in 2008. So all of this is happening at steady speed, and we are going to see, probably within about a few years, perhaps 5 years, a much more powerful Russian military in Eastern Europe than we have seen up to now, more powerful than at any time since the end of the Cold War. And it is not obvious how exactly NATO is going to respond to this. All these problems of NATO militaries that I've talked about, the lack of interoperability of many weapons, the poor training and low morale of many troops, the disorganized logistics and all the rest, that seems set to continue for the indefinite future. And the emphasis of the United States anyway is going to presumably shift further to confronting the challenge from China in the Western Pacific. So given that this is so, it does seem to me that it is becoming increasingly likely that the military balance in Europe is going to start shifting increasingly in Russia's favor. Moreover, it seems that beyond that, the Russians are modernizing even further their air forces, and we also know that they have already to a great extent modernized their strategic forces, their nuclear deterrent. So the reality is that with this shift in the military balance, NATO's ability to project power close to Russia's borders is going to increasingly dim. Now, I'm going to say again, this was entirely predictable. It was obvious that the closer NATO moved to Russia's borders, the stronger the Russian reaction was going to be, and that reaction would take a military form. Moreover, it was also likely, almost inevitable, that in an area around Russia's borders, the Russians, with their far shorter internal lines, would be able to pile up troops and equipment in a far more rapid and convincing way than the United States and its NATO allies ever could. So all of this was entirely predictable. It shows how misguided that policy of shifting NATO eastward and of trying to draw countries like Ukraine and Georgia into NATO always was. It has not strengthened NATO from a military point of view. It has weakened it by creating an impossible overcommitment crisis and disorganizing and weakening NATO's internal coherence. It means that the United States and its key allies, Britain and France, and Germany to some extent, are now committed to defending places like the Baltic states and southeastern Europe in the Balkans, where they are always going to be comprehensively outmatched by the Russians, and which, to be completely frank, European, Western, and American publics probably care very little about. Nonetheless, foolishly, perhaps expecting that the Russian collapse of the 1990s would continue indefinitely, that is what they did. The result is, as Scott Ritter says, that NATO is now incapable of defending NATO, let alone of intimidating or projecting into Russia. As they say, he who sows the storm, the whirlwind shall reap. Thank you for joining me on this video, and I look forward to you joining me in future programs, both on this channel and on our main channel, The Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. And please also check us out on our various new platforms, BitChute, Odyssey, Locals. There's a new platform that we're just very excited about, and which we're just now joining. And also, if you can, support us. I know it's difficult in these hard days and these hard times, via Patreon, Subscribestar, and PayPal. I would say that it's not easy doing the sort of work we do on our channel. Some people don't particularly want us to say the things we do, but if you think what we say is useful, then please support us as you can, either in that way through your donations and payments. And remember, we accept payments now in all currencies, including the new electronic ones, or alternatively, and it's a perfectly good way to do it too, by pressing the subscribe button. YouTube has been known to allow people to lose their subscriptions for no great purpose, and to press the like button too. And also, last but not least, check out our Discord server and go to our shop and see the amazing things we have there, the wonderful t-shirts and hoodies and hats and sweatshirts, and of course our famous and magnificent magic mugs. Thank you for joining me on this program, and have a wonderful day until you join me again for my next one.